I want to make a video here on a subject that I'm very interested in, but it's also a subject that you have to be slightly wary about because it's the sort of subject that can provoke so-called cyber wars. Let's say that it's the sort of subject people can get very heated on. Um, so I'll try to make this video in a respectful and balanced way. It's about the power of nations. Now, I've been watching a series on YouTube called TestTube. And despite the name, it's got nothing to do with like medical stuff. It's actually to do with international statistics, demographics, especially regarding nations, nation states, economics, military power, all that sort of thing. And they have a particular playlist called "The Strength of Nations" or "The Power of Nations." Um, as someone who follows current affairs and who's very interested in politics and so on, naturally I'm interested in the subject. Um, and I think they have a good series. It's obviously an American channel, but I think it would be unfair to say that it's sort of American propaganda because if you actually look at the videos, they are quite balanced. I saw one, for example, they go through a number of powerful countries. One video, um, how powerful is China? There's quite a number of comments on there that are sort of accusing the channel of being anti-Chinese and pro-American and all this sort of thing. But if they actually look at the video, how powerful is the United States, that video was also quite balanced in the sense that they talk about strengths and weaknesses. It's not just focusing on strengths; it's also focusing on weaknesses. So I don't think I think this is quite a good channel. I think they're quite professional. I think they're quite objective, and the videos are snappy, much snappier than mine, I might add. Like I'm talking 2, 3, 4 minutes each. So if you get a chance to check them out, it's Test Tube and it's just called The Power of Nations. Um, so I want to share a few of my own reflections on this. Firstly, although the subject I find interesting, I'm always a bit uneasy with nationalism in the sense of sometimes you see this all the time on the internet, between not just powerful countries, but most countries, especially if there's been historical injustices, especially if there's been a history of tension between two particular countries. I mean, if you go on the video to pretty much any China Japan video or Turkey Greece video, or there could be a wide variety of other possibilities and scenarios where you would see a lot of negative comments and a lot of mudslinging on both sides. I try to avoid that for the most part because I don't want to get dragged into what frankly amounts to childish discourse. A lot of it isn't really um, done. A lot of the people commenting there are just interested in throwing out insults to the other people in the other country rather than focusing just on the individual they're debating with. So that puts me off the sort of dialogues. And although I've been involved in a few of them, I'm trying to limit that because I don't think it goes anywhere. Um, but the reason I want to talk about this in this video is because when we talk about the power of nations, there's an obvious ego factor involved. There is a bit of prestige about being seen as a powerful nation, and I guess for smaller countries, they must look at more powerful, more influential countries and see this as a bit. There might be some resentment there, but I think there might be also a perception that there is a lot of gesturing and a lot of saber rattling between big countries. And sometimes it's positive; it's not all negative. You have trade deals and so on. I made a video recently on the tensions in the Pacific, so that would be very relevant to what I'm talking about here. Anyway, how do we define strength of nations? Well, I believe to truly look at this, you have to look at every sort of area, and it isn't just one thing. So you would need to look at the economy. Um, how big is a nation's economy? And it's important to point out that the size of an economy isn't the same as actual wealth. So, for example, the United States has the world's largest economy, but I believe it's about sixth in per capita GDP. I believe Qatar or Liechtenstein is first. That alters slightly each year, but the size of an economy and the wealth of a nation is not the same thing. Now, I don't think anyone would call Qatar a superpower, but it is, by the last UN statistic anyway, the world's wealthiest country. Um, but the United States has the largest GDP. So GDP size is pretty important. That demonstrates basically how big an economy is. But I would argue also the well-being of a society, how well off people are. And I'm not saying that as a communistic sort of statement, like, the people sharing memes or something like that. I'm just saying that I do think that the more fair a society is, and the less of a gap between wealth and poor, that should also be taken into account. And in that regard, a lot of Western countries would fare quite badly, actually. Well, to be honest, most countries probably would. I'm not sure which country is top of the list in terms of the lowest gap between wealth and poverty, but I know a lot of countries have a very big gap. So countries that are closing that gap, I would give them plus points. I think that is a positive thing, and I think it's because you can be a major military power, but if your people are miserable, doesn't count for much. So, like I say, to me, this takes a lot on board because the well-being of a nation, the well-being of its people, in my opinion, actually gives the country strength. This isn't just a sentimental thing, like, oh, that's sort of it's a nice situation and people are happy. It actually, in my opinion, actually gives a country strength because if you have a relatively content society, relatively speaking, that society is more likely to be stable. So that's why it directly relates to strength. The third category is a very big one, and it's one that can't be ignored, and that is military. And throughout history, needless to say, the military, in its various aspects, has been used as a barometer to test the strength of nations, because war, unfortunately, is part of humanity, is part of the story of humanity and the human history timeline. War is a negative part of the human story. Therefore, the countries that have a lot of weight in terms of military prestige are going to be seen as powerful. Goes without saying. Now, in this regard, there's a few things to look at. Nuclear powers, i.e., countries that have nuclear stockpiles. At the moment, there is 8 countries in that grouping, roughly. There might be, Israel. There's question marks over whether or not Israel has nuclear weapons, but let's say about 8 or 9 countries altogether. And yet there's powerful countries that don't have nuclear weapons. Germany and Japan come to mind, and Brazil for that matter. Um, then there is the size of the military personnel. Again, this can be misleading because North Korea has a massive army, but most statistics will show it as being dirt poor and in many other respects very weak. So actual personnel numbers, I think, is less important than how efficient an army is. Um, I mean, the British Army, for example, is relatively small compared to compared to quite a lot of other countries. Our numbers are somewhere around 150,000, which is a lot smaller than a lot of other countries. And yet, the British Army is generally regarded as one of the most highly professional in the world. And that's not just because I'm British myself. This is proven by the fact that you have British Army personnel, British military personnel go to other parts of the world to um, train less advanced armies in basically the art of combat. Also, I would say experience is important. That a country that has been engaged in more military activity, whether it be war or whether it be peacekeeping or in any capacity, is going to be, if it's more experience, is presumably going to be more professional because of years of experience. Military defense spending is an issue and that would come into where is the defense money going to. So countries that have a high defense spending, in that sense, could be seen as powerful. But again, where is the money going? I mean, Russia, for example, has the world's second highest defense spending. It's generally considered a very powerful army, but the average Russian troop, average Russian soldier, is not seen as. I think there is a perception that they're less professional than some other countries. And this could be because, from my perspective, the Russian state treats its troops like shit. Um, I said at the start of the video I didn't want to provoke anyone, but I guess I can't avoid that. There are going to be things that I'm saying in this video that might piss some people off. I'm sorry for that, but I'm just sharing my opinions here. In my opinion, the Russian state treats its soldiers like shit. I mean, for example, with the recent conflict in Ukraine, the Russian state won't even admit how many of the troops were killed out there. Um, so military is a very big thing. It's to do with the technology as well and what sort of weaponry a country has. So, for example, if we talk about naval power, maritime power, countries that have aircraft carriers are generally that's seen as a big thing with naval supremacy. Now, 150 years ago, Britain was a naval superpower. We can't really claim that today, although our navy is still quite impressive. We no longer have an aircraft carrier, at least for the time being. I should actually amend this. We are building the HMS Queen Elizabeth. That will be an aircraft carrier, and it's due to be completed by 2017. So, this is just a temporary situation. Um, but I wouldn't say that combat experience is everything because you have other countries that have almost no post-World War II combat experience. An example would be Japan, and yet they would still have much better technology than, for example, a lot of poor developing countries. So there's a lot of factors to look at. Um, what else can determine a country's power or, well, influence, I would say as well. If a country has a big cultural influence, that I think would then certainly prestige to its position in the world. So a country that, for example, has a very big tourist revenue or is widely visited, I think it's not necessarily an indicator of power, but it would have some strength insofar as global prestige is concerned. So I think that would need to be taken into account. So countries that have very high tourism levels, it doesn't necessarily make them powerful, but I think it does add to some prestige. Um, Also cultural influence. I mean, the BBC, for example, remains the world's largest news media network. So in that sense, that would add to, and because it's the British Broadcasting Corporation, that would add some weight to our global prestige because the BBC is worldwide. And although CNN, Al Jazeera, and some other networks also have quite a lot of weight, as far as I know, the BBC is still the largest news network in the world. So there's a whole lot of aspects to this. The strength of media, for example. It's not necessarily the same as propaganda, but I guess you could relate it to that. So, I mean, um, it depends how state media is used, if it is used internally or if it's used externally. That is a big factor. Although I should say the BBC is independent from the government. It's not directly linked. That's an important point to make. So there's a lot of other things to take on board. Um, Again, maybe the prestige of a leader of a nation, could that be a factor? Because you might have some nations that aren't necessarily seen as major economic or military powers, but if they have a very charismatic, famous leader, that may give them some prestige, may not. I think that's a matter of debate. Now, the head of state of my country, the United Kingdom, is Queen Elizabeth II. She's also head of state of a dozen other countries. But the question is, does that give the UK any prestige as the mother nation, or is it simply giving her prestige as an individual? Again, this is a subject of debate. Stability, internal stability, I think that's extremely important. How much internal stability a country has, I believe, would be quite an important factor in determining its internal power, actually, because if a country is unstable, not necessarily in a state of war, but maybe in a state of prolonged protest, that will damage its economy. And economics, like I said, is a very important thing. So needless to say, countries that are going through a period of civil war are going to be heavily damaged economically because investors just won't want to put money there. But even countries that have ongoing protests, If there is damage to that nation's credibility, then it will have an impact. I mean, during the 2011 riots in this country, I believe that did damage our tourist industry, albeit for a short time, but it did have an impact. So there's a lot of different things to take on board with this. So having said all that, I want to express my own perception of what I believe to be the world's maybe 10 top 10, 15 powerful countries. Taking all those things on board. I'd add another one, maybe the prestige of institutions within a country, for example, tertiary level education. If a country has world-class universities, I believe that definitely adds weight to its credentials. But like I say, there's a lot of things to take on board. Natural resources. There's a lot of countries that would claim to be number one in the production of certain material, mineral, um, and then in certain rankings they would be ranked first. So if you're taking everything on board, it would be almost impossible to have a consistent list that is country A, country B, country C, because every list will be different if you take everything on board. But broadly speaking, and let's say through the law of averages, through the law of just taking everything on board and sort of looking at the overall picture, I would say that this is probably as follows. The United States would still put number one because it ticks all the boxes of the major things: economics, military, and by and large stable internally, although I would argue less so at the moment in some other Western countries because of the breakdown in trust between the police and the public and racial tensions and so on. So I do think it would be fair to say that the United States has some drawbacks in that regard. And in terms of its political system, the actual power of the presidency, for example, is limited. The president has to answer to Congress, and he cannot declare war, for example, on his own. So there's a lot of things to take on board, but I still rank the United States number one simply because the statistics are unmatched. That doesn't mean America leads in everything. There's a lot of categories I'm sure that America would trail behind in production of certain materials or in human development index. Although the United States is high, it's not the highest. So that's not to say it's the highest in every list. But overall, I'd say the United States is still number one. Number two, I'm going to say China. And this again is not in every category because Russia would lead China in certain categories. But overall, I would say China. The military factor, although important, it isn't. I don't believe it's actually the most important thing at the moment. I think economics might be slightly more important, although they're both very important things. And at the moment, the Russian economy is quite lackluster, whereas the Chinese economy is still growing. Although it's slowed down, it's still growing. So I put China number two. Russia I put number three. More or less for its military might, the fact it still possesses a huge nuclear arsenal, and only the United States and Russia come anywhere close to having the sort of stockpiles they're estimated to have, which go into the thousands. There's other countries that have hundreds, but Russia and the United States are still, I would argue, two major military superpowers. Although China's got a formidable army, it has problems with corruption and actually lack of combat experience in recent years. So there's other areas that affect China's military, but China 2, Russia 3. Number 4, and this is where it starts to get hard. For number 4, I'm going to say either Germany or Japan. The reason being is that although both countries had to undergo significant changes to the military structure for obvious reasons in the post-war years, they still remain major powers in terms of technology. And actually, this isn't something I mentioned before. Technology should be also considered to be a major factor. Technology, maybe even aeronautical spending and all this sort of stuff. But Germany, Japan, I'm going to say joint fourth. Um, Although Japan, actually, I might put Japan slightly below Germany because Japan doesn't dominate Asia in the way that Germany really has a big influence in Europe. So, okay, I'll put Japan below Germany. But Japan still heads the way in technology in a lot of areas, and Japan's still a pretty formidable country. And under Shinzo Abe, its military is being reviewed. Its military approach, that is. So I'd still say, although the Japanese economy has been, in something of a decline in the last 15 years, I would still say it's generally seen as a powerful, influential country. So I put Germany 4, Japan 5. Number 6, I'm going to say the United Kingdom, my country, France, on par with each other. Um, and like I said, this point starts to get tough. I would be tempted to include Brazil and India around this category as well. Now, the reason I put India below the United Kingdom and France, I'll explain in a minute. But France and the UK, like I said, I try to be objective with this. The United Kingdom, we have many weaknesses, and we have had clearly not the power that we were at the time of the British Empire. That is quite obvious. Nevertheless, we are the world's sixth biggest economy. We're a nuclear power. We have a very professional, highly advanced military. Maybe the personnel numbers are smaller than other countries, but in terms of actual technology level, we're pretty high. Tourism, we're one of the top countries. We have world-class universities. So there's a lot of plus points in determining the UK as a great power. We have a seat at the UN Security Council. Um, Nevertheless, we have a lot of drawbacks. We aren't the power that we once were. We don't have world influence. We have regional influence as part of NATO, as part of the EU, and as a member of the Security Council, we have some influence on a global scale, but not comparable to China, Russia, or the United States. And France, I could almost echo. I mean, the situation of France and the UK is very similar. France, like the UK, had a very large empire. It's now declined, etc., etc. The French military, people joke about it, but it's actually quite a powerful military, and they actually have more nuclear warheads than we do. So I'd put Britain and France almost exactly equal. I think that would be a fair assessment. Even economics, roughly the same. There's so many areas the UK and France are very similar in. Again, joint sixth, I'd be tempted to include Brazil. The reason being, Brazil is definitely an emerging power. It's went through a democratization process, and it's been stable politically for some time. Although this year it has seen quite big protests, but you can get that in any country. I think Brazil is definitely an emerging power that would need to be evaluated as such. Drawbacks, still serious poverty, high crime levels could create uh, stability issues. But it's a major country, and it's got a lot of natural resources, and I know it has ambitions to be the first non-nuclear superpower. So Brazil is definitely a country to watch, and I'd be tempted to put it, if not quite on par with the UK and France, in number seventh place. Um, okay, so seventh place, I said possibly Brazil. Canada and Australia, without a doubt, need to be pretty highly ranked. Now, the only reason I don't rank Canada and Australia, with all due respect, as high as the UK or France is simply because their militaries are smaller, they're not nuclear powers, although they have massive resources in terms of natural resources. Um, I don't think they have quite the same military weight as the UK or France, and that would probably be the only reason I put them slightly below the UK and France. But to all extents and purposes, Canada and Australia are not superpowers, but they're pretty formidable countries. I mean, Canada especially might well top the list in terms of natural resources, although Brazil and Russia and Indonesia, for that matter, will probably um, be able to claim that as well. Um, Getting in the eighth position, then I start to think about countries like South Korea, Italy. The reason I don't rank Italy higher is political. It comes across as politically unstable. Italy doesn't seems to have difficulty keeping a prime minister for longer than a year. And with all due respect to Italian viewers, although Italy's an advanced developed country, I don't think it can honestly be compared to Germany and to the United Kingdom at the moment. Nevertheless, in terms of cultural influence, Italy would have to rank very, very high. Um, Not just from the Roman Empire, although that is history, and I don't think we can use history to talk about today's situation, but in a lot of areas, it's one of the world's most visited countries. Um, it has some very high levels of productivity in terms of, for example, wine production. So there's a lot of areas Italy would tick the boxes. But I don't think for example, the Italian military is quite on the same level as the British or French military. So I put Italy, Canada, Australia, South Korea, um, Turkey, India, and Pakistan all around the same band. Now, India, I want to talk a little bit about because I know some people will be raising eyebrows and say, "Oh, wait a second, India and Italy on level." The major issue that makes me put India in this position and not higher is poverty. And many Indians, if they're being honest, will admit this as well. India has a level of poverty that is crippling and is much worse than the situation in China or other developing economic powers. I think India really, really has a challenge with that. So India is a nuclear power. It's a fast-growing economy. It's got a very important digital sector, and it's got a growing Silicon Valley in Bangalore. It's a major power. It's a very powerful country, and I wouldn't want to mess with the Indian military. But that poverty factor, to me, definitely holds India back. Also, there's times India comes across as unstable, not only in terms of religious tensions, and let's be brutally honest here, India does experience sporadic bouts of serious sectarian tension. I don't think anyone can honestly ignore that fact. In my opinion, religion holds India back. That's just my personal opinion, but that's it. But in many other ways, India has a lot of potential. But I would say those factors, poverty, corruption as well, really hold India back, although corruption is something that can be found in a lot of countries. China is also held back by the corruption factor. Incidentally, I haven't had time in this video to go through every single weakness and strength of each country because believe me, if I was being 100% comprehensive about this, I could give a lot of plus points and a lot of negative points for each country. So I would put all of those countries around about the seventh, eighth, ninth positions. And like I say, it does get quite difficult to really evaluate at this stage. South Korea I rank quite high because it's a very developed country. It's got a strong digital sector and technology sector, and it's a pretty formidable military force. So for all those reasons, I rank South Korea quite high. The reason I don't rank it higher is because regionally it's sort of sandwiched between China and Japan, and it honestly isn't a major world player in the same way. It's not on the UN Security Council. Um, Nevertheless, I would say it's a developed and quite powerful country. Um, Spain is also a country that could possibly be in around the same band as South Korea and Turkey. But this is very, very broadly speaking, this is very roughly evaluated because with a lot of the countries I'm talking about here, you could point out one area which is stronger than another. For example, you could say, oh, well, how can you compare the Indian military to the Spanish military? But then you'd look at other areas. For example, Spain has much less poverty than India does. So a lot of this is about comparing and contrasting the influence that a country has culturally, militarily, economically, and in terms of the Human Development Index. And then just to be absolutely fair, in case people think I'm talking, oh, by the way, Pakistan, I briefly mentioned. Um, I do rank Pakistan as a powerful country, but its power is limited because of, for example, the internal turmoil that it's been going through. And again, I believe that religious theocracy holds it back because when you have a situation where religious laws are dictating everything in the nation, that holds back a lot of progress in a lot of areas. Um, and that brings me also to Iran and Saudi Arabia. They would rank highly. I mean, Saudi Arabia as a regional power is, it's, I would say, tied with Iran as the strongest power in the Middle East, possibly slightly ahead of Iran. Then Egypt can be brought in as well. So there are a lot of countries here which I would put in a sort of second band tier. So just to evaluate this, rather than going one, two, three, four, five, because that's a more controversial sort of criteria, I would put it this way. There's only really one true superpower, that's the United States. But Washington shouldn't be complacent about that because China and Russia are still very formidable countries. And although they might not match the US economically or militarily, they have a huge amount of weight in the world. So um, I'd say the United States, China, Russia are sort of in the same tier level, although the United States is clearly ahead, I put those three countries roughly as the world's only true potential superpowers, and the United States is the only actual superpower. I know there's talk about the European Union as one entity being a superpower, but I'm not even going to talk about that in the video, simply because I'm not talking about groupings of countries, but individual countries. Second tier, I'm going to say countries like the UK, France, Japan, Germany, possibly Brazil and India in that second tier of countries. Possibly Canada and Australia if I was pushing it. Um, The third tier is all the other countries I've named, basically. But then you get countries that would be considered regionally quite powerful, but not internationally. A country like Nigeria, for example, would probably be seen as one of Africa's most formidable nations, except on a world scale, probably not so much. Again, Indonesia is an emerging power. It's went through a democratization process. It's an emerging economic power. I'm not sure about its military level, but it would be quite it would be worth mentioning as well. I think the main criteria that would be looked at is economically, and that's not size of GDP only, but also the well-being of people, military, human development index, cultural influence. All of these things are important. Anyway, I'm going to keep this comment section open, but I'm going to see how it goes. If I'm getting a lot of sort of nationalist comments like, "Oh, you stupid British bastard, you blah 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 blah," I'm going to close the comment section because that really isn't the point of this video. And I'm just sharing my own views here. I'm not trying to. I guess I can't make a video like this and then, you know, I'm sure there's something that I've said in this that will irritate people. By the way, the reason I didn't include North Korea is I don't think it's that powerful. It may have one nuclear weapon and it's a massive army, but it's dirt poor. It's a failed state in every other sense. It's a very small economy, so I don't think we can truthfully call North Korea a powerful country. The only thing that would indicate it is the fact it's the world's most intense dictatorship, and but in every other sense, I don't think it's that powerful. Um, so with all those things taken on board, let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with my broad rationale for this? What would be your own ranking? And I'm not going to be nationalistic if you put my country lower than it is. Although feel free to explain why. I believe most rankings would put the UK around sixth. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll leave it there. I know I've spoken at length, but there's a lot of material to cover with this one. Um, yeah, that's it really. Finally, this is not intended to provoke a cyber war. It's really, really not. I'm just talking about the subject because I'm interested in it, and I think it is interesting to debate what constitutes a powerful country. One final point I would make: when we talk about power, the bully factor is important. For a country to be seen as powerful, I think it should also be respected by the global community and not seen as a bully. So if a country is powerful just because of military factor, I don't think that's enough because that is a bully factor. I think a powerful country will also use its power for benevolent purposes, for example, in humanitarian aid towards other countries, in disaster relief towards other smaller countries. Um, and I think that's an important point. I think, for example, the United States, at times it's been called a bully, and at times it's been called sort of like a major power that's defending weaker countries from another major power. And that would very much be the argument right now in the Pacific. I guess the American position would sort of be that they are the head teacher, sort of disciplining the bully in the playground, beating up a smaller kid. So if you imagine China being the bully and the Philippines being a smaller kid, that could be an analogy, but of course, my Chinese viewers might feel angry about that, so we could easily switch it around. Whatever. I'm not trying to provoke anyone with this video. I'm just sharing my thoughts. That's all. Let me know what you think.